From walking barefoot in the snow to hiking for miles for a view, it feels good to connect with our simpler side. Simplifying your wellness with Kachava's all-in-one nutrition shake feels good too. With 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, greens, adaptogens, and more. No fillers, no nonsense, just the highest quality ingredients. New customers get $20 off an order of 2 bags or more now through January 31st when they go to Kachava, KACHAVA.com, and use code FITNESS.
All right, so this week with Kevin Rye from Think Fan Engagement. I'm really glad he could join us. I mean, it's kind of a prescient time for thinking about fan engagement when your fans storm the stadium and get a game called off. Fan engagement has gone a bit wrong. So, Kevin, great pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, look, let's get into what Think Fan Engagement is first, and a little bit about your background. You spent a long time with Supporters Direct, so deep in the world of working with fans and understanding fan culture and supporting clubs and fans do it a bit better. So, yeah.
So me, I mean, I'm very much kind of what some might call an activist PR. In the trade, it's a known term. It's people like me who've kind of been out there experiencing the organisation as a user, in this case a fan, of my club, and I came nose to nose with the worst excesses of bad ownership as a Wimbledon fan, and that's where I became involved with the campaign to try to stop the franchising in Wimbledon, which isn't something we succeeded in, sadly. But the results aren't bad. Obviously, fan-owned, up the division, 6 promotions, whatever it was in, however many years, a ridiculous journey. Again, it's something we seem to like to do at Wimbledon. We like a challenge back at Plough Lane. But I got taken on within a couple of years of finishing that in 2002. I ceased my involvement in anything formally to do with Wimbledon, in that sense, although I dipped in and out since then. I just got on with being a fan like everyone else did. But a couple of years later, Dave Boyle, who was acting managing director at the time of Supporters Direct, asked me to come and work for, I think it was a 3-month contract, maybe a 6-month contract, and I stayed for 11 and a half years and learned an awful lot about the relationship between clubs and fans, beyond just mine. And I do see it as a privilege of being able to travel across the country and then across Europe, meeting with loads of different people, from the smallest clubs to the smallest groups of fans to the most active and organised biggest groups. And towards the end of my time at Supporters Direct, spending a lot more time with clubs, governing bodies, politicians, the people trying to influence the direction of the game, and also actually being there and being part of I think the trigger to much more organised fandom across a much wider group of fans in English football. When Man United, through Shareholders United, and then the Man United Support Trust, had always been an active part of that movement, of the trust movement. But once Spirit of Shankly at Liverpool eventually were able to come on board, it was to do with really one organisation per club, and politics meant it wasn't politics, it was the organisation meant we couldn't take on SOS as a member for a while. But once they came on board, along with the likes of Spurs and Chelsea and Arsenal, what it meant was that you were getting the big clubs, so-called groups of fans, not just being there but working across county lines, as it were, and
okay.
And that for me was a very special time, very enjoyable, very exciting. And leaving in 2015, I kind of muddled around the world of consulting. Found, to be honest, it wasn't such a great place to operate in. And the reason really was simply that, I put it in the terms of language and dialect, is that clubs could understand a lot of what I said, but couldn't understand me in full. because they didn't speak that language, if you like, and they didn't do that because it just wasn't the way that they did the way they did supporter relations, if you like, at the time.
Okay.
Engagement was something that was just not really the same as I regarded as that it should be, or was best practiced. So I kind of eventually settled on this idea of the fan engagement index as a way of defining it, of categorising it, of understanding it, and also seizing the term, because I was sick to death of hearing fan engagement being spoken as, by this app, analyse data in this way and you solved your problems. You never solve your problem. It's a relationship.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Manchester United being a case in point, they think fan engagement. Well, in fact, they talk about it on the investor calls all the time. They talk about it in terms of clicks and views and downloads and media consumption, which is a very different thing.
They're expressions of, look, those things are a part of it. They're a part of the sequence of the practice of the relationship. Of course they are. But for me, and it's, I'm not doing a disservice to my some of my friends and also colleagues in what I do, like Tim Crow, who does a podcast with me, who are marketing experts. But I think I'm afraid that marketing seized far too much of control over what engagement was about, and it became far too much about a sort of a drive towards monetization and the expression, the practice of it in a very practical sense, and the sale of something. And those things happen at the end of a relationship. And I don't have a problem with talking in terms of clubs being a business. What I have a problem with is people not understanding the type of business it is, and it's a very special one, and that's why, hence, what I do.
Okay, and so you published something called the Fan Engagement Index, which is, a very easy way of sort of looking at and viewing and measuring engagement. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then I want to get onto what best practice looks like, and perhaps talk about some of the leaders in that table that you produce.
Yeah, so as I said, it was about kind of creating a common understanding of what engagement is, what fan engagement is, and in its own sense, it's what I would call a positive disruptor. It's meant to shake things up a bit, get us all thinking a bit more clearly about what we're after. It focuses on 3 areas of dialogue, transparency, and governance, which are slightly doughy terms at times. They're a little bit academic sounding, if you like. And I don't like being too farty about it, but you have to be sometimes. You have to be a little bit, you have to say, right, we have to set some professional standards. So I use those terms because they're the terms that we used at Supporters Direct. And which also I'd add that the successor organisation, because SD no longer exists, the FSA, they will use those terms as well. So anyway, dialogue being the methods of having those relationships, either with individual fans through big fans forums and big open meetings, or online through help channels, which quite a lot of clubs have, Twitter help channels. Then you might have the type of thing you've got, which I think is the fans forum at Man United. Well, look, in terms of the terminology, look, a fans forum tends to be the big organised meetings for any fan to come to. Fans parliaments are what the fans forum at Man United is. Then you've got the close one-to-one relationships, where you might have board to board. The Spurs Trust were meeting. Spurs, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, the board of that, and the chief executive and the senior operators, and then you might then go right to the top of it, and you might have that being expressed through a much more formalised arrangement. This is where you then get into the governance, and all governance is about is underpinning it. And what I've done with that is I've taken things like supporter directors, or supporter representatives, what we call a customer charter, support liaison officer, and those are things. And in those first 2 categories, the dialogue and the governance areas, those are things that have been mandated by football. So what I'm doing is saying, so you've determined through various means that these things are important, that these are recognised as good ways of having dialogue or underpinning dialogue and making the relationships work. I'm just going to hold up a mirror. So I'm not creating something that doesn't already exist or using measurements that aren't recognised. Yeah. Okay.
And presumably you have some kind of liaison with Supporters Trust and clubs to get the information, or is it all independent?
No,
okay.
No, I'd say the final category being transparency is about one of the biggest problems is clubs don't publish what goes on. In which case, why the hell are you having the meetings? Because the fans don't understand whether or not anything's happening. So no, what I do is essentially really mirror the journey of a fan. If I want to find out what's going on at my own club, I look on the internet, don't I? I find a website, and I try to find out what's happening, who represents me, where can I find out what's been going on, how can I get out? What about the SLO, Sport Liaison Officer? So no, it is intentionally done that way. Because also, if you're going to disrupt in that way, in a very, as I said, I think it's a very positive way, and it's been proven to be that. Then, if you go telling people that you're about to do that, then you've given them the heads up, and I don't think that's fair. And it's the same for my club. It's the same for it's same for every single club. I use the same methodology because I don't want it to be unfair on Man United, and I don't want it to be unfair on Exeter City.
Sure, yeah.
But
do you ever get any pushback?
I mean, in the first year, you can go and see the BBC story. I brokered it with the BBC both times. And the first year, I think the EFL particularly struggled with someone external, and I would like to think I'm an expert in the field, but someone external saying that some of your clubs are not doing very well. I think they've realised there's no point being, outwardly, I'm afraid it did come across as a bit thin-skinned. But, my view is that if you're good, you've got nothing to worry about. If you're bad, then you've got something to worry about. So, but no, I mean, really, especially now with the fan-led review of governance that's going on in English football, I think I don't think, there has been an embrace of it and an understanding that what I'm trying to do is to work with everyone to improve this. And I work with clubs as equally as I do with fans. I still have excellent relationships with a lot of the activists, and I have excellent relationship with a lot of the people running football clubs. So, my view is if I'm going to try and build, help to build the bridges, then I need to be like that, and I need to be even-handed. And I will sometimes not be entirely positive about what some fan organisations are doing. It depends.
So Exeter came top, I think, in the last index, if I'm right in saying, and let's use them as a model for best practice then. So what are Exeter doing right that some other clubs, in the northwest with large football grounds and very little engagement are doing wrong?
Well, look, I mean, the first thing that's important to note that with the index is a snapshot, right? I was reticent about a table. My colleague and expert in this sort of field in other businesses who helped me put this scoring system together, Ollie Holtaway, he kind of put his foot down and said, you really do need to have a table. It's the thing that's going to really appeal. People are going to be able to understand much more through data in that way. But Exeter, look, I mean, Exeter are owned in a very particular way. So yes, they score better, partly because of that. But one of the things to note is that in the top 10, there are a good number of clubs that are fully privately owned or very majority privately owned. And I'm talking sort of more than 75.1%, 75% plus one share. So really, they're fully privately owned. And they do well too. And the reason that I can say that, look, you can look at Exeter and you can look at Norwich, you can look at even Everton a bit further down the table, is because they have good ways of listening. They have ways of listening to what fans have to say, and in the best cases, in the case of someone like Exeter, lots of ways of doing it. So it's not just, here's your fans' parliament, we'll listen to you and that'll do. It's, we'll listen to you there. They obviously, have directors on the board. They do fans forums. They listen to organised, a group of organised fan organisations in a sort of parliament as well. And then they have an SLO channel where they listen that way. And I do emphasise the listening because a lot of it is about that, and hearing and listening to things you don't want to hear sometimes, because that is what good leadership is about. It's about listening to, absorbing things that aren't necessarily people saying, "Aren't you brilliant?" And actually, the best leaders do that. It's just
and the thing is, it always struck me about some of the bad practices with fan engagement is even if clubs want to think of us fans as just purely customers. I mean, good customer relations can still be good engagement, can't it? Yeah. I mean, you want to keep your customers happy because you keep coming back.
Exactly. I mean, look, I think you can. That's entirely true. I mean, and actually, part of part of my view on this is that, look, we shouldn't be shy in saying that fans are sometimes customers. I don't buy this relentless nonsense about, I'm not a customer. You're purchasing stuff, right? There are times when you're going to go into a shop, the club shop, and buy a shirt. If someone sells you an Everton shirt and you go into the Man United shop, or sells you a shirt that's got the crest on the wrong side, or, you're going to act as a customer because that's part of your relationship. The point is that what informs my act as a customer, what makes me a customer in that sense, is something that's not even, you can't really describe it as love. It's almost insanity, because you keep going, you keep going back even when you're crap, right? All these fans of Man United who carried on going when the club got relegated in the 70s, or likewise at other clubs. This is something that's normal. When you're tight, when you're not doing well, why are you going back? So, the key is the balance. And coming back to the sort of best practice, the best ones are the ones that understand that. There are so many, and I might add that because the nature of the snapshot means that you might have a club like Brighton, say, who don't perform that well in the table, but culturally get it. And it's woven in, and it's woven into a lot of what they do. So the thing about them, for example, is you look at them and go, well, what, you're not doing very well in the table. Yes, but the thing about that is, if you listen to the Fan Engagement Pod and Paul Barber on there, for example, he absolutely understands the job he's got. For sure. Yeah, and he understands, and there's some things that he does that, I know there's a whole row that emerges from time to time about flasks. I understand why that's happening, and we don't need to go into it, but it's complicated, and there's a lot of health and safety issues there, and you have to make decisions, and they might not always be the right ones. But when it comes to it, culturally, they get that relationship and they understand it. And, that's the other part, is that going out and looking at what's working isn't necessarily always expressed in a table. But a lot of the time, the best performing ones are going to be, they're locking it in, they're making it permanent. So they're saying, well, it's cultural, but what we need to acknowledge is that if we don't own the club anymore, it's still the same football club, and it still requires, it still requires that structure. And that's, for me, is one of the most important lessons. That's why it's not about fan ownership. Although I've always been very clear that I regard fan ownership as a superior model. It isn't going to happen anytime soon. So stop sitting around waiting for it, or even trying to prosecute. If you want to prosecute that as a fan, try to make that happen, fine. Even a bit of fan ownership, fine. But you've got to if you want to make it even possible, then it's in your interest to make your club better at engagement anyway, because there's a cultural problem in English football where clubs haven't historically appreciated that relationship, and that's what a lot of this fan engagement index is really about.
No, that's right. I tend to agree with you. I don't think it's a binary a binary thing when it comes to fan ownership. That it's all fans or no fans. Yeah. And we've obviously had that conversation at United for many years now. I mean, since Must, or it was called Shareholders United before that, was formed, and I know many of those guys, obviously, and kind of instinctively support the idea of fan ownership. But United, $3 billion corporation, whatever it is these days, it's not going to happen anytime soon, for sure. I mean, you mentioned Tracy Crouch's fan-led review. Do you feel optimistic about what that might bring? She's certainly quite bullish. She's saying regulation is going to happen. There will be a regulator. It's just what the scope is that's under debate now. Yeah.
Look, I think it helped when Tracy Crouch was appointed, because she is someone who has credibility. She's, she isn't just, in these sorts of situations, you end up with a talk with just, someone who's not going to cause too many ripples in the pond. So it's good that she's been appointed. Yeah, questions about some of the people, who have been appointed to the panel, to the people who are leading the review. They're not fans. Yeah, I understand all that. The thing I think with this, having, maybe quite call myself a veteran. Well, maybe I would, of countless reviews, formal and informal, in the game, contributing and helping to contribute to them, and dealing with a lot of politicians, good and bad, on this, is don't invest it all in that anyway. I mean, look. I think it's a good thing. We absolutely need better regulation, smarter regulation, whatever you want to call it. We need more regulation. Clubs are not free trading enterprises. At no point, although obviously with one exception, and I'm not going to go into it because it's very personal to me, you can't just move a club around like a normal business. It's just not what happens, right? So they are, local monopolies operating in closed leagues, closed federations of businesses. You don't get that kind of monopolistic position and just be allowed to do what you want. So we're going to have some change. And we're going to have some appreciation of the cultural significance and difference of football clubs versus other organisations. And you're going to have some proper locked-in fan involvement in the running, I think, of football. But I also think, and you might say I'm bound to say it, I think there's been a chasing after this will solve it, that will solve it. And sometimes that's because, overall, some form of fan involvement actually will solve quite a lot of the problems, because they'll force clubs to have to listen, and that will shift culture. But also, I think sometimes, at United, share ownership has been a big thing for a long time because of the activism of Shareholders United, because of the opposition of Murdoch's takeover. I get that. Yeah. It's slightly different at different clubs. Arsenal, it's a similar situation, I think. But that isn't necessarily the case in others. So what you've got to have, I think, is also some measurement of what works. And so, what I do is try to create that. So if what we can have is a combination of forcing the game to be more transparent and open in a meaningful way and not just words, and then some structural changes, then I think what that will help to do is to open up to what is a very active and highly organised movement of fans that's been there, that we helped to create that at Supporters Direct. And right. I think, the legacy of our work is now there, of these massively organised groups of, people like Duncan and colleagues at Must doing what they do, and that dedication. And it will allow them to take a much more active role. And I think that's good, and it will mean they have to carry responsibility. But I think a lot of those groups, A, want it, and B, can cope with it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the professionalism around organisation of some of these groups is impressive, and the ability to activate a fan base very quickly. We've seen over time. I mean, at different points, Shareholders United, very effective, and then in 2010, after the bonds were issued, and the green and gold protests, you'll remember, they were very active in bringing that to fans and getting the fans protest in the stadium and in the media. Most recently, I mean, Must clearly didn't organise the storming of Old Trafford. That was some other fellas. But it's the legacy of engagement is sort of seen there. I don't think it's healthy for that to happen too often, but it definitely sent a message.
I think, the position is often condemn it. Well, look, of course, I'm never going to advocate people invading pitches, especially during global pandemics, right? The question for me is let's roll this back, right? Forget the fact that a pitch was invaded in those circumstances. The fact of the matter is that fans are angry anyway. That pitch invasion and those actions don't suddenly, and I don't think anyone's really arguing that, doesn't suddenly mean that opposition to something that was deeply irresponsible on the part of those clubs who took part in it is suddenly okay. That's we've had a tendency to think like that sometimes in this country. I think in England, in the UK, is, well, just because you did something wrong, therefore that means everything you said about this is now wrong. No. We need to deal with the root problem, right? Disconnection. It's disconnection, really. And I take a view that it's not that the Glazers live in the US. It's not that they're American. It's that they're disconnected. I point very often to Cambridge United. He's a UK. I don't know if he's a US citizen. I think he is. But their owner now owns all the shares, Paul Barry, and has been a majority owner for a long time. He's lived in the US for years. He's not disconnected. The reason that Cambridge United perform as well as they do in the fan engagement index, and they've got a supporter director, they've got all sorts of mechanisms for listening, is because he's connected. And the reason that Liverpool, Man United, Spurs, the reason that Juventus and Barcelona and Real Madrid did what they did was because they were disconnected. And I might add in the case, obviously, of Madrid and Barcelona, shamelessly fan-owned.
For sure, yeah.
And still behaved as though it was theirs to do with what they wanted. Now, for me, this is the question, is, are you connected? What's going to make you more connected as an owner? And a lot of the time it's going to be listen to these people. And you know what, for me, is I get it's a ball ache sometimes. But the ones I speak to, the clubs I speak to who do this well, whether it's a Norwich or an Everton or whether it's a Lincoln or a Doncaster or an Exeter or wherever, is actually there's an enjoyment in it. And what you get into is a sort of cultural appreciation of it, and that actually it helps you to deal with it. It helps you to deal with the difficult times as well. It doesn't mean that everyone enjoys a 3-0 spanking all of a sudden, but it does mean that you can manage those moments on the pitch that don't work out so well, like Norwich getting relegated, much easier. You don't end up with people outside, Carrow Road or Old Trafford in your case, with placards demanding the resignation of the board or the manager. Yeah, people will grumble. You might screw up. But what it allows you to do is for people to understand what you're doing more clearly. They understand the strategy. This idea that strategy has to be hidden in a boardroom is one of the biggest pieces of nonsense peddled in football. And that somehow, if we're letting everyone know what we're doing, we're going to get beaten every week. People have hidden commercial strategies for years. They won't share information because of this nonsense idea that somehow you're giving your opponents an advantage. Compete on the pitch. Stop tying your laces together off it. Start working with your fans and collaborating more with them, because that's now also an expectation as well, more broadly in society.
I think so actually, and again, coming back to different markets, there is a different expectation from. I'm mid-40s, so I'm turning into an old man now. But amongst the younger generation, that there is more collaboration between brands or companies, and they, I think that's true for sure, And although football populations are getting old too, because it's bloody expensive to go.
It's worth pointing out as well that again, just emphasising this all the time, is that this idea that was peddled that younger fans are disconnected, they can't cope with more than 25 minutes of that was just the realms of the ridiculous by the time Perez was talking about that.
Yes,
but if you go out and look, young people, look, I'm in my late 40s, young people are really connected. And there is, whether you like it or not as an owner of a business, there is an expectation that you as a business, you as something I care about, are going to have to be much more responsive to me. We've come through a period, we have changed, we are going to change more. That transparency that you sort of think means that you just do loads of bants and pictures from the training ground. Well, look, yeah, to some extent that's true, but it does mean you're going to have to open yourself up a bit more. And as I say, in the end, it's going to do you good. Ultimately, though, if it's something you're deeply uncomfortable with, go and buy a shoe shop. Go and buy a leisure centre. Go and work in something completely different, because it's, this is where it's going. And also, I also get that it's a big change and people are a bit fearful of it. And it's going to mean that those fans who are privileged to be able to hold positions of responsibility representing other fans, and individuals who get much more of an insight into what's going on, because, the global transparency is important, the overall transparency to all fans, not just running it all through one process. They're going to have to take on more responsibility too, but they will. They'll have to sign agreements not to let certain information out. But I don't know anywhere where that's really ever been a problem, because once they're in there, the fans are, they will take immense responsibility on their shoulders, but they will also be immensely respectful, because it's an institution they love and adore as well. And it hurts a lot of fans to have to, put their clubs under this kind of scrutiny. They don't want to do that, in my experience.
Sunlight's the best disinfectant, as Boris Johnson once said. And although I think we should hold him up as an example here, I think.
Yeah.
Look, I agree. I think fans, there's no reason why fans can't be professional and responsible in their duties if they end up in board positions or liaison positions or something. as a United fan, I'm obviously not that optimistic. There's been a lot of sort of PR after the Super League disaster. An interview with Joel Glazer, something published on the website. We had the PR sort of absolutely shamelessly spouting lies for 3 minutes in a broadcast interview. And then in the midst of all that, they still took a dividend. And it just, hey, they own the business. They can, I suppose. But it just seemed to be a big red flag that they still don't get it.
Look, I mean, but public relations is my sort of profession. It's what I've done. I've done a diploma in public relations. I very much am a PR. I don't regard a PR as someone who does, who's there to spin, or it's not a media relations role. It's about managing the organisation's reputation with the people who care about it the most, particularly in football. And if what your aim is to understand PR communications as something which is about deflection and managing crises, which ultimately are being self-inflicted because you're doing things that you think are fine, but self-evidently don't go down very well with the people who are the most vocal critics, or are going to be the most vocal critics. Well, take a look at your strategy, man. But this is partly down to different business cultures clashing. But as I said, in the end, if you don't want the discomfort that you're going to get from making decisions like that, go and own something else. But I think these people are not stupid. This is you're talking about a tanker in football. Clubs were originally, as Dave Conn will say, were originally members clubs. Yes, they were. And a lot of them still are outside of the top four divisions. But they have become the preserve of one individual, usually a bloke who owns something else and feels like he's got the right to do whatever he wants. Yeah. And that may well have worked because actually locally, it was literally, in the case of Man United, wasn't it, the butcher?
It was the Railway Workers Association first, and then the butcher. Yeah,
I was thinking it was the the private the era of private ownership.
Yeah, Louis Edwards. Yeah.
These people, they were there. The social roots and all that kind of stuff, and community and society. It was all very different. But look, just because all of that has shifted, and we've gone through 20 or 30 years where it's all been very, very different, and we've got these apparently huge enterprises. Really, they're only supermarkets compared to the massive hypermarkets of the truly big firms. They are still rooted institutions, and clubs still want that in how they talk about themselves. Man United still wants to be a Manchester club. It still understands, or wants to be seen as understanding that. So look, if you're going to do that, understand that those things have consequences. And that it might mean that your ability to take a dividend or make a decision that actually might be okay if it was your own private company is different to what you can do with a club, which, whether or not you like it, is morally, in the possession of generations of Mancunians and other people who've fallen in love with that club.
There's that old Seinfeld joke that he says, what is being a supporter anyway? Clubs move cities. I mean, sadly, in the case of Wimbledon, they do move cities, and much more often in the States. And they change owners, they build new stadiums, and the players change all the time, and the coach does. So what are we really supporting? It's the shirt. That's the only thing that stays constant. But it's a good joke, but the reality is the thing that stays constant is the community and the fans. It's a cliche, but what is football with?
Well, that's it exactly. Look, that's what you're buying, and the fact that someone's managed to spin a yarn that actually these are global brands that that you can sort of take around the world, and you can get fans in China. Well, that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. That's going to, that's not going to change what the club actually is in the end. So
it shouldn't do. Yeah.
No, it won't, because that tension will always be there if you don't resolve it. And the way you resolve it is by understanding that the reason that the people in China are so attracted to club A, B, or C is because of what that club actually is and what it means, and the geographical location and the culture around it, and the fan culture, and its crest and where that comes from, and the fact that all the stories that we have, and the Newton Heath Railway workers and all of that stuff, the green and gold that was there for that period, which is celebrating the roots of the football club. Don't use that stuff if you can't appreciate there's going to be an impact, because that is expressing the roots of the football club. So all we're doing is coming back. I don't have a problem with people making money out of football if they're running the business sensibly and they understand what it's about and what it really is and what it really means to people. If what they do is pretend it's something else, that's where you're coming a cropper.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation once with the then head of digital for the NBA, who do a fantastic job with their media proposition, the access, the type of content, their full production house. Their second market is China. They've had some interesting relationships, if you've been following any of that with China. But they did really well. And the theory behind that was exactly as you're saying. Look, the club's there. The club's got its fans. They'll engage on a local level. But 99.9% of NBA fans will never get to a game. So how do we make sure that we get everyone else involved too? And your last podcast was on what does it mean to be an overseas fan. As listeners know, I've now moved. So, there is a small supporters club of Manchester United fans here. It's an interesting mix of expats and locals who get together to watch games. There's a small community. It's different. It's not like going to Old Trafford. But none of that, as you're saying, should change what the club is locally and how it engages with local fans. And, hey, Manchester United aren't suddenly going to be getting good at this. They're still going to think of themselves as a media company that just happens to play football now and again. But I'm hoping they're just like what we've seen post Super League is an absolute expression that on the surface they might say some stuff, but deep down they're going to be resistant to any kind of change.
But I think a lot of clubs are going to be. My message is embrace it, because you're not going to find any more reliable custom than you will get with a club, and secondly, it's going to be a ball ache if you don't, ensure that you're doing it in a sort of full-throated way. Be understanding of that. I mean, the one thing about, having international fans is one thing. Appreciating that doesn't mean you can go off and play league games there. That's one thing you're going to have to understand. That whole silly nonsense of the 39th game was rightly binned. And, we were involved in helping to do that alongside other organisations at the time at SD. Appreciate that you're not going to be able to play a league game on Mars, right? It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to start playing league games in China. This is what, I'm afraid this is partly what a football club means. Sometimes there are some things you cannot do and should not be doing. And the idea that somehow football needs to have that to make it better or to make it more appealing, well, do you know what? As I said, go and buy something else. If you can't cope with what a club is, buy something else. But as I said, it's also reasonable to expect football clubs to be able to make money and to be able to sign the right kinds of deals to sweat the asset. So it's in the end, it's about understanding, this isn't some kind of hippie lecture about, love each other, because there's tension in this relationship and always will be. But the listening helps to reduce that tension, and incorporating people into the way you make decisions and getting people to understand why you're doing things, it's going to do you good in the long run. And it's a good thing to do for the business that it is.
There's an influx of private capital into, there has been, as you mentioned, lots of new owners over the last 20, 30 years. But the one thing that's been sort of changed recently is private equity groups, who manage money on behalf of other, usually, wealthy individuals or institutions. And Burnley's been bought out, leveraged buyout. So, looking at that as a big red flag. So was Lille in France and others around Roma, others around Europe as well. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think these groups, they're bringing money into the game in theory? It's only in theory with Burnley. Are they going to engage? Do they care?
It's a good question. I mean, the issue in English football is that when you buy the club, you effectively have a vote on the regulation of yourself. And that's a problem, whether you believe in independent regulation or what you might call a sort of multi-stakeholder model, where it remains in the confines of the environment we have now. So I'm kind of hinting at what might come out of the end of the review, the fan-led review. But I mean, certainly, what I do isn't there to have a view on ownership, but from a personal perspective, it worries me deeply. And I don't think leverage buyouts should be permitted. No, I think that's the model it doesn't work. That's the problem is that there are plenty of cases in all sorts of areas of business where it doesn't work, because it's basically kind of an experiment to see if you can grow the business. And the problem you've got with a football club is that it has limits to its business because it's a football club. So, personally speaking, I mean, I would be making sure that I think things like stadia just have to be removed from the equation completely. It used to be the case until early 2000s when Douglas Craig at York City removed the ownership of Booth and Crescent from the football club and kind of said, I dare you to pull me up on it, because there was a rule that prevented it. And that rule didn't get implemented, and he was able to do what he was doing. That fell away. That then meant that football clubs sat on vast property assets, and having a designated asset of community value like Old Trafford or Anfield, that isn't really much protection, I'm afraid. All that is a right to bid for an asset if it comes up. What you need to do is football just needs to understand where does the value lie, and quite often it can be in the property asset. So lock those away. Start to remove some of the reasons that all sorts of speculators, good and bad, get involved. Reduce that risk. Then what you do is you reduce the chances of the wrong type of speculators coming in. And then if people do want to speculate, reduce the ability to leverage against the asset, against the football club itself. So I don't think you ban certain types of owner, and I'm not so convinced, for example, of having patrimony handed to a golden share in the football club and saying that clubs, that they protect themselves by saying the supporters trust has a right of veto. You could have that, but remove some of the things of value. Remove things like the property asset, reduce the opportunity to speculate, because if we acknowledge that football clubs are special institutions that are monopoly businesses within an environment which is a monopoly in itself, then we can't treat them as ordinary businesses. Therefore, we should be regulating and removing the opportunity to mess up that delicate ecosystem we've got.
Yeah, I know, and it may seem sort of harmless and financial shenanigans. What's happened at Sheffield Wednesday and Derby, where they've, the owner has sold the ground to himself, but that can have long-term consequences, as we've seen with other clubs, where suddenly the club falls into other hands and they don't own the ground. So yes, I think some kind of regulation around that would make a lot of sense. I mean, look, I'm personally very open-minded about what comes out of this review. I think we've had some strong hints about what will come out and the type of models, and I don't think it will be what Gary Neville wants, which is effectively like completely even sharing of the money that football generates. And hey, I might even support that if it came with sensible financial controls that stopped football kind of eating itself, which it does, because you had 20 teams in a league and 4 leagues. Everyone's going to compete with each other. The incentive there is to take as many risks as possible, and so I think there's a lot of good could come out of this, and I don't think there is one model that is the right one, because we've seen challenges. We see challenges in Germany. We see Bayern Munich fantastically successful, Borussia Dortmund almost as successful, not quite, but almost. But down the league structure, there's an awful lot of mess, both financial, bad running in clubs. That isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. And as you mentioned, Real Madrid and Barcelona, utterly shamefully, the presidents there thought they owned the club. I mean, if you listen to Perez, he still and all the leaked audio, he thinks he owns the club in the worst kind of way.
Well, sadly, that's those are at least in name fan owned, and they are member owned, but that's the system they have, which doesn't really allow for the proper democracy that is meant to be there to flourish. But look, in terms of regulation, ultimately, And my preference is for anything that's going to increase the ability of clubs to listen to their fans and incorporate them into decision making, to ensure that engagement has, that it's properly underpinned, that it's permanent, that it doesn't disappear with an owner's preference. A new owner decides they want to do something different and they decide they don't want to listen to those fans anymore. All of that. When it comes to the financial and sort of, wider organisational regulation, from a personal perspective, I think, you've got what I will always acknowledge is that engagement will only go so far. What engagement is not going to do is solve the long-term financial problems and the problems of poor organisation. And I think also, and it is the clubs that have hamstrung themselves quite often, is a lot of the stuff that would help them to learn how to do engagement better anyway. It's hard to share because they don't want the money spent on that. They want the money from the central broadcast contracts and other income. They want as much of that as they can. So leagues, the EFL in particular, they'll find it very difficult to be able to say provide training and education and stuff on how to run a football club that's open and engaged with their fan base. So this is we could spend hours and hours and hours just looking at engagement. But in the end, if what happens is there's a bit of engagement and nothing really changes on the finances, you're going to have the same problems again in 2 or 3 years' time because it's just a cycle.
I think that's right, yeah. Anyway, look, it was a real pleasure having you on the pod this week, and glad we could talk about this. I might give you a buzz after that fan-led review comes out and see how we react to that and see whether I think that's going to make a difference. But thanks for the work you do. I do think it's important. Indexes do matter. As simple as just publishing a table gets people thinking, and that's the first step along the journey. So thanks for being on. Good to chat to you. Good luck for the new season with Wimbledon.
Yeah. Very optimistic, but there you go.
Very optimistic.
We all start off optimistic in July and June and July, and then come April or May, well, let's see, eh?
Yeah, we'll see with United. There are some signs that perhaps finally have a director of football maybe making some sensible decisions, at least with the compartmentalised part which is on the pitch. The rest of it I'm not so sure about. Anyway, thanks a lot. Have a great one, and speak to you soon.
Thank you.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.